And joining me now is Ethan Lane, Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Ethan, we talked earlier in this show about the policy-making process at NCBA. Tell us how that process informs the priorities for you and your staff.
Well, there's no one on my team that doesn't have that policy book printed out on their desk. It's kind of our quick reference guide. Most of us know it by now, you work with it for enough years, but that really is the beginning and end of every policy conversation in Washington. Whether we're educating a new member of Congress or reacting to a piece of legislation that may have unintended consequences for our members, that 150 some odd pages allows us to go in and cite for them specific areas and say the entire industry has looked at this. Cattlemen's associations from coast to coast have debated and voted, and this is the position of the industry on this particular issue. That is absolutely invaluable. It's not just us making it up as we go along, right? It's really speaking for hundreds of thousands of cattle producers around the country. So whether we're talking to the White House, whether we're talking to USDA, having that framework in place that really gives us clear guidance on how producers believe these issues should play out is critically important.
You mentioned education. I've always been impressed about some of the activities and events you do to educate both the White House as well as other lawmakers about the beef industry. Tell us a little bit more about that.
These things tend to kind of take on a life of their own based on what the issue is. And sometimes that means getting some members of Congress out in the field where they can see these things firsthand. It's very different to talk about this in a hearing room in Washington, D.C. than to be boots on the ground somewhere around the country. Sometimes that's educating staff. Sometimes we do briefings up on the Hill where we can talk about a specific issue. We're getting into the dietary guidelines process again. That's a big opportunity to talk about how important it is to keep beef at the center of the plate. There's always something new in Washington, and there's always, along with that, new staff rolling through, both in the White House and up on Capitol Hill. So the education process never stops, and we're always looking for creative ways to do that. Sometimes it takes the form of political advocacy, with our political action committee and the events we host in our office in DC. Other times it's taking it to them in a legislative capacity where we're lobbying them. But this team is as good as it gets at making those switches depending on what's needed in any particular day.
And one of the common denominators is developing those good, solid relationships with lawmakers and regulators. Why are those relationships so important to your effectiveness?
If you're coming into an office cold and they don't know you and you don't know them, you're just not going to have as productive a conversation as if you've had years or months, in the case of some of these newer members, to build that level of trust, right? When I tell you something, you can count on the fact that I'm going to be leaning on my policy book. You can count on the fact that I'm going to be speaking not for myself, but for the members of this association. And building that trust that they can depend on what we say, we're going to do what we tell them we're going to do, and also that we're going to hold them accountable when they don't do what our producers want them to do. All of that fits into that bucket together, but that relationship building is job number one for our team. Even when there's nothing going on in a particular agency or a particular office, we're still out there talking to folks, having phone calls, making sure we're in front of them and they know who we are, because a lot of times these issues can pop up and then they know who to call too. It's not always just us going to them.
Mm-hmm. So highlight, if you will, for our viewers, some of the key wins that you and your staff have had because of those solid, trusting relationships you've built over the years.
Sure. Well, one of the things that has to happen every year is we have to fund the government. And that ends up being a really important opportunity for us to maintain some of the things that otherwise would be difficult to get done in Congress. Livestock hauling, hours of service, is always a big issue for us. And that looming threat of the electronic logging devices that are out there. We're able to use those relationships to maintain a block on that in those spending bills every year. Looking at greenhouse gas emissions reporting for livestock operations. That's something that we talk about how much time we spend on something like WOTUS, the EPA opening up another front there in an area that scientifically is almost impossible for them to do and doesn't achieve what they want them to achieve. We're able to attack things like that in spending bills. We're able to educate members of Congress and get bills moved in a direction that they're more helpful for our producers. Mm-hmm. And then there was those oddball things, the rail strike last year that everybody was so worried about. We were talking about that last summer before anyone else knew that was going on. We were participating in calls, writing letters to the White House, and managing that issue behind the scenes. And a lot of times, that's really what that looks like. If we're doing our job, we should be able to keep issues from impacting producers before they ever even hear that they're happening. We want to try to make sure that we're out there on the front line. That's a lot of what we do in Washington.
Preempting those issues before they become a big problem for all of us. One last question. For folks watching at home, what guidance and advice advice would you give them in terms of how they can support you and your staff's efforts in DC?
First and foremost, join NCBA, join your state association, and then, this is the thing I preach all the time, don't assume your neighbor is making that phone call. Don't assume that the guy next door is out advocating for this issue. Don't assume it's like it is in your area of the country, everywhere else in the country. Your perspective is important. I was up in New York a few months ago at beef producers and talking about the fact that their business model is so much different than even one state either direction. Sure. And that's true everywhere in the country. So it's so critically important that our producers stand up and make their opinions heard and involve themselves in these processes all the way from the county to the national meetings.
On behalf of all of us as cattle producers, we thank you and your staff for all you do.
Thank you.
A great way to support NCBA's work in Washington, D.C., defending and advocating for the cattle industry, is to become a member. It's easy to do. Just call toll-free 866-233-3872, or you can visit the website ncba.org.